Good evening or good morning, wherever you may be in the world today. It's your sister Shaya, lawyer, the historian, back again with another story time session. We are still reading The Great Cosmic Mother, Rediscovering the Religion of the Earth by Monica Stew and Barbara Moore. We are currently on the chapter Beyond the Male God and His Machine. Let me share my screen and we will get started. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Okay. Under Islamic law, virgins cannot be executed. So, in Iranian jails, prison guards systematically gang rape young female prisoners sentenced to death, thus rendering them fit in God's eyes for execution. Pregnant women prisoners in some American jails, notably the California Institution for Women, are routinely strapped to their beds at the ankles or wrists throughout their labor and childbirth. Under 24-hour surveillance, the enchained women are unable to move, turn over during sleep, or help themselves in the most minimal way to ease labor pains, though the woman in labor is not going to be, in anyone's opinion, a great security risk. Hundreds of young women are killed yearly in India in the notorious dowry deaths, in which a young bride is set afire by her in-laws as revenge for inadequate or incompletely paid dowries. The new bride is doused with kerosene and then ignited with matches. This act is usually performed by mothers-in-law, or women do this to other women in acts of stupendous greed and self-hatred, conditioned by religious ideas that define sons and males generally as spiritual beings, while daughters and other females are defined as income property. One of the most popular X-rated video games before it was removed from circulation in response to protests from Native American and feminist groups was called Custer's Revenge, in which a naked General Custer scored points by raping bound Indian women. One of the most popular X-rated films ever made is the notorious South American produced Snuff, in which a live woman is raped, mutilated, and disemboweled before the camera. This film has been shown throughout the world, and its popularity has spawned many spin-offs in which the gang rape, torture, and murder of women and also children is not simulated by actors but really done while the cameras roll. To provide sacrificial actresses for these films is a function of the global slave trade in women and young girls. Snuff has been shown in some American prisons, ostensibly to entertain male prisoners, many of whom we can assume were imprisoned for rape and killing women. In America alone, torture pornography films are $1 billion business. They run the gamut for Driller Killer, in which women's skulls are drilled to pieces, in which college women are cut to bits by a professor with a chainsaw. The distributor of the latter hopes it will become a cult film for kids. Despite organized protests of feminists worldwide, the production and sale of torture and pornography films, home videos, and video games continue to soar, with global distribution following patterns of global development. A 1983 film called Make Them Die Slowly showed not only women but Aborigines being tortured. The National Secretary of the Moral Majority, lecturing in the early 1980s at Earlham College, A Quaker affiliated school in Indiana declared that the United States should have used atomic or hydrogen bombs to win the Vietnam War. Moral Majority and other fundamentalist American religious patriotic groups believe that God gave nuclear weaponry to America and that we have a moral right, indeed a moral duty, to use the weapon that God gave us. When new recruits are inducted into the Israeli Defense Forces, they are ceremonially handed one, a gun, and two, a copy of the Old Testament, in which God commands and justifies the righteous slaughter of thousands upon thousands of unbelievers. The biblical Old Testament is a historic record of massive holy war conducted in the name of God against Gentiles, and also in some cases against Jews by Jews. And most of the mutilations and massacres in it, including those of pregnant women, children, and suckling infants, are considered by its patriarchal writers to be fulfillments of the will of Yahweh. In the Pentagon, group Bible reading sessions and prayer breakfasts are on the increase in the 1980s, or at least the Joint Chiefs of Staff are more openly under President Reagan's administration, displaying their religious beliefs. At many prayer breakfasts conducted throughout America recently, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, John Vesey, has urged his audiences to enlist in God's army, while Admiral James Watkins, the chief of naval operations, declares in public speeches that the 1983 Beirut bombing that killed 241 Marines was the responsibility of the forces of the Antichrist. These 7 news items were not selected at random, nor do we consider them to be disconnected. They are 7 facets of a world ruled by a male God, or rather by a definition of God derived from 4,000 years of patriarchal ideological domination, in which countless daily acts of aggression, human degradation, and sheer ugliness not only but occur inevitably as the acting out of basic patriarchal principles and premises. All these news items occur all these news items record the acting out of patriarchal ontology. The patriarchal godhead of all major world religions is defined as 1, a god of righteous war; 2, a dominator of women; 3, a god of wealth and hierarchic power; 4, an imperialist God who controls vast resources of wealth and power by controlling the female body and its reproductive processes as exploitable property; 5, a sexually puritanical God who defines sex as unclean and evil, and thus elicits violent pornography as the sexual punishment and exorcism of women; and 6, a God who thrives on policing and punishing life itself. The world's definition of God is the self-definition of humanity. The gods who rule us from above are simply mirrors in the sky, faithfully reflecting our own faces. The gods who rule us from within might represent deep truths of the mind and heart, or they might reflect the profound self-distortions of 4 millennia of ontological misperception. We do not know if a God is a true God or a false God until we see what kind of world is created in that God's image. When we look around today at the world generated by the male gods of patriarchal rule, we see warfare, degradation, suffering, and sadism on a scale such as Earth has never seen, nor will ever see again. For of course, if we don't end it, it will surely end us. Nor is it a problem of blood, of Muslim blood, or Hindu blood, or Christian blood, or Jewish blood, or atheist, communist blood, but a problem of ideology. If we embrace an ideology of justified holy war, we will be forever at war and inflicting war on others. If we worship a punitive God, we will be forever punished and punishing others. If we believe in a religion that dualizes the human sexes into mutually hostile, dominating, and submissive categories of beings, then we as sexual human beings will be forever dichotomized and ravaged by hostility within ourselves and among ourselves, and we will inflict our internal alienation and ravagement on everything we see forever. This is all very, very rudimentary, but once it has been set into motion as world machinery, every living thing on earth is entangled in its gears. All our functions become definite, definitively embodied in its functions. And it's very hard for those living inside the machinery to stop the machine, because our lives and all their ontological terms have come to depend on the ongoing machinery in all its terms. Because as human beings, we not only worship our gods, we become them. The God humanity follows is the kind of humanity we are and will be. What kind of God do we want as our definition? We will know the answer to this more clearly as we come to understand the kind of God which for 4,000 years has been defining us, has been imposing its definition on us human creatures, via the machinery of patriarchal religious, economic, and military systems. The God of patriarchy from the beginning has been a God of war and economic exploitation. Incessant warfare and yeah. Incessant warfare and economic exploitation have characterized the 4,000-year history of this male god, a time span that is very brief relative to the 300,000 to 500,000 years of humanoid life on Earth, but still long enough to make us feel as a species that it has always been this way. It is no surprise that the world of today, the apotheosis of patriarchy, is a world of war and money. What else rules us anywhere we go on earth? The paradigm of continuous large scale war is the institutionalized dualism of the sexes into good spiritual males versus evil material females, or male versus female, is the first holy war. The paradigm of continuous look the paradigm of continuous large scale economic exploitation, did I not just read that, is the institutionalized control of female reproduction by a ruling male elite. Male controlling female reproduction is the first boss controlling worker production, the first assembly line domination of human energy. In the modern world, we are told there are two very different and competing economic power systems, but in fact, they are ontologically the same, deriving from the same God of war and exploitation, from the same patriarchal definition of human life as a function of some larger abstract category: God, the state, the marketplace. American-based private enterprise monopoly capitalism defines human beings and all of nature as functions of the marketplace. Soviet-based public enterprise monopoly state capitalism defines human beings and all of nature as functions of the state. What is the ontological difference? To define human beings as functions or exploitable means rather than as sacred ends in ourselves is to create by definition a perpetual state of war. Together, these two world machines, known politically as the US and the USSR, grind away as functions of each other, producing state economies and private economies in apparent or rhetorical conflict. both in reality subservient to one global unified war economy, which in turn serves both, and in which both collude. For perpetual war is necessary against mock enemies and against one's own people in order to maintain human beings in a perpetual condition of exploitable means rather than sacred ends and ourselves. This is why a patriarchal God begins and ends as a war God. To maintain himself in power, he must wage war against human life. His priesthoods, sacred texts, doctrines, and dogmas exist to rationalize this horrific state of incessant warfare as man's spiritual destiny. His social and economic institutions exist to provide continuous cannon fodder and spoils for continuous war. A global god of war, served by the global religion of money, defines the human condition today. Our various nationalities, our sectarian beliefs, our local customs, our personal opinions may serve as individual definitions, but they no longer define the condition of the world in which global missile systems and global factory economic systems have rendered national, sectarian, local, and personal definitions merely soporific and, in fact, obsolete. All humanity today lives under one global God, the God of war, who is continuously empowered and enlarged by the religion of money. The arms race is now the major global economy. The world economy is now a war economy, with virtually all national military systems and military budgets taking precedence over all domestic economies and domestic budgets. World Priorities, a nonprofit American research organization, in their published World Military and Social Expenditures for 1979, found that developing nations with populations of 660 million people who couldn't afford basic subsistence were yet spending over $90 billion a year on military power. And this was 8 years ago. In 1979, according to World Priorities, the world was investing 2,500 times more in the machinery of war than in the machinery of peacekeeping. 8 million children died in that year alone from hunger and illness related to malnutrition. America, the Earth's strongest military nation, had in 1979 over 25 million malnourished people and at least 10 million children who had never seen a doctor. In total, for 1979, in pounds per person, the world had more explosive power than food. And this was 8 years ago, before the arms race heated up again, before the resurgence of the Pentagon budget under the Reagan administration and the consequent leap in military spending in all other countries, before the terrible famines in Sudan, Ethiopia, and Bolivia, before the cutbacks in American welfare programs and the consequent diminishment of domestic priorities in governments worldwide. According to the most recent statistics, for every soldier on earth, the average military expenditure is 20,000 yearly. For every school-age child, the average public education expenditure is $380. For every 100,000 people in the world, there are 556 soldiers, but only 85 doctors. For every $1 billion spent to provide 28,000 jobs in military goods and services, the same expenditure could provide 57,000 jobs in personal consumption industries and 71,000 jobs in education. As Ruth Legger Sivert, director of World Priorities, writes, the vast development problems of the 1980s, like the unbridled arms race, must be understood in human terms. It is not the world economy nor the national security that is in danger, it is people. The modern world is painfully off balance, opulently rich in arms, poor in providing for the needs of human lives. It is this social deficit that represents the most urgent threat to world security. Spending for arms not only fails to meet these needs, it intensifies them. This is the ultimate irony of the search for security through invincible military power. It threatens the society it is intended to protect. In short, what the arms race means in human terms is that more people are condemned to die of hunger and of foul water, children to grow up retarded in body and mind, the special needs of the elderly to be neglected, people to live out their lives in fear and with hate. It is not only the deprived who suffer as a consequence, all of society is affected by the waste of human resources. But these are reasonable mortal words from a reasonable mortal woman. Looming over her high as the sky is a god, the war god. All the present day world is in the grip of psychic and material servitude to him. And if we review the past 4,000 years of human history, this makes perfect sense. Just as the underlying motivation of Bronze Age patriarchy was profit through war, war on the female, war on nature, war on human labor, so the ultimate goal of patriarchy must have been the same, the profits of war. For 4 millennia, war has been the factual source of patriarchal power. Through the mass terror, mass rape, and mass exploitation of war, through the wartime generation of mass hysterical energy, through the war-oriented manipulation of female reproduction, through the mass conversion of human and natural resources via war into profits for the few and social order, hierarchic role playing, organized repression, and death for the many, the war machine has virtually created the world as we know it, or as the creator of our psychic and structural world. War is God. As both William Irwin Thompson and Paul Virilio have pointed out, the city began as a fortress. Virilio, an urban architect, claims that the city is the result of war, at least of preparation for war, that is, of large scale patriarchal professional warfare. And gods generate not only worlds and social orders, but also belief in those worlds and social orders, a belief that overwhelms human reason. Secular humanist liberals and reasonable mortal women have always tended to underestimate the depth and extent of the human male's identification with war as a God experience, as well as an experience of personal empowerment. It is not accidental that the government's social programs, public welfare, health, education, the environment, transportation, art and culture, etc., are identified as domestic and female, while the Defense Department's programs are always promoted as global and masculine. Nor is it coincidental that liberal male politicians who support the domestic programs are always being challenged to defend their genitals against charges of wimpiness, softness, and bleeding heartedness. Ponder that last one. Before the 1984 elections in the United States, support of young men for the Republicans was at an all-time post-World War II high. According to a New York Times article summarizing pre-election poll results, young American males and older males too, of course, identified with the image of power projected by Ronald Reagan, in particular, nationalistic warrior power represented by a tougher military posture and increased weapon spending vis-a-vis spending for soft domestic programs. One urban male professional was quoted as saying that at his workplace, the guys stick to Reagan primarily because they see the race as women versus men, with Reagan standing for the values of men. or the patriarchal war god, stands for and has created a social order that empowers men to the degree that it gives them power over women and over life. As for the ruling elites to whom patriarchy has given manipulative power over both men and women, the war god has always been a profitable machine. Fueled by their money, it not only returns wealth manyfold, it also returns social order, patriotism being so often a repressed form of revolutionary energy. Social order allows the ruling elite to enjoy the profits of war and relative peace. This machinery has worked for us for 4,000 years. Why stop now? So, say the owners of the machinery as they collect the profits. In the past, war has always been something the ruling elite felt it could control or manage via money and political clout. That the mushrooming of the Bronze Age war gods into a nuclear god of global war threatens their own continuance seems to be overlooked data or an apotheosis they refuse to deal with. The global war god now looms over them as well as over everything else on earth. But this ontological challenge does not seem to be regulating the behavior of the war financiers or the people engaged in weapons manufacture and sale. Or everyone underestimates the power of a god grown to global proportions in his material as well as psychic manifestations. As further evidence of the logarithmic growth of various patriarchal war gods into the global god of war is the fact that the development of the world's male populations into primarily armies or military technicians or researchers of one kind or another has become the major global channel of male energy. In the third world countries, the army has also become the major mode of male survival. While women sustain agricultural and craft work in many nations or struggle to keep themselves and their children alive in the burgeoning refugee camps created by continuous war, males are able to obtain food and shelter only by joining the army, the National Guard, or other armed policing force. Thus, the war god machinery perpetuates itself on three levels: that of belief, of profit, and of daily survival. As the patriarchal war god has become the global god of global war, the state of holy war has become global, inevitable, and continuous. As a Christian, Paul Virilio distinguishes between the historic idea of a just war and the fanatic pursuit of holy war. But in the age of nuclear technology, there is no room or time left, in his opinion, for a just war. All war today is fanatic and also technologically devastating. All war has the potential for rapid acceleration into total war. But to maintain itself in power, the patriarchal system must maintain the world in a continuous, chronic state of war of one kind or another. Holy war is all war, or it is religious war self justifying. Whether the war is conducted between nations as classic warfare or conducted within a nation as a national guard or policing action against the nation's own people hardly makes a difference anymore. Further, as Virilio underscores, it doesn't even matter if wars occur or don't occur on any large scale. It is the preparation for war that maintains the military in power by draining the social sectors of all sources, money, and will. Whether we are fighting others, fighting among ourselves, or just chronically getting ready to fight, it makes no difference anymore. We are effectively ruled by the God of war. We are effectively living and dying in a habitual and structural state of perpetual war. And what is the purpose or result of such a condition? As Virilio says, unconsciousness is the aim of pure war. But as we know or should know, consciousness is the aim of evolution. So the ultimate aim or effect of the patriarchal pursuit of profit through war is counter evolutionary. On a mass scale, it seeks to drag us back to a state of oblivion before human consciousness began. This correlates with the urge of patriarchal religion to force a human de evolution back to the primate state by controlling human reproduction as though it were the same as mammalian reproduction, and by denying the fact of human female evolution into a unique state via the menstrual cycle in which sex and reproduction can be separable. This female evolution away from the primates was, in a very real sense, the beginning of human consciousness, a consciousness which patriarchal religion has tried to reverse via control of female sexual and reproductive activity, and which the patriarchal war god is now seeking to destroy one way or another by forcibly maintaining the human species in a state of continuous war or continuous preparation for war. Cui bono, we may well ask, and the answer is ultimately no, but the war machinery of the war god neither asks nor answers such questions anymore. It is entirely automatic. It just keeps turning, warring, preparing for war. Like the apocryphal Christ, it says only, I have come to destroy the works of the female, and that is seen as all of life, all of the earth, and apparently all of human consciousness. The other face of the patriarchal God is economic exploitation. Economic exploitation and war, as we have seen, are two faces of on one head, inextricably connected. Just as the ancient shared work and celebration ritual groups of women were the original communalism in which matrifocal cultures men participated too for at least 300,000 years. So the Bronze Age patriarchal desire to control female sex and reproduction, and thus all human labor and production, was the origin of fascism. The American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language defines fascism as a system of government that exercises a dictatorship of the extreme right, typically through the merging of state and business leadership together with a belligerent nationalism. But throughout 4,000 years of patriarchal history, state and business leadership have always been merged, and the merger has been maintained in power by a belligerent nationalism or the war machine, always in the service of state and business interests, both at home and abroad. The only thing missing from this definition is the role of patriarchal religion or a deified patriarchal ideology in providing a defined rationalization or heavenly mystique for the Phacetic apparatus. If we follow this definition, it is not too far fetched to say that the history of patriarchy is the history of fascism, and that patriarchal economics or economic systems have always been Phacetic economic systems in which court, state, religious, military, and business ruling elites collude in mutual empowerment and power reinforcement to exploit human labor and Earth's resources, beginning with the exploitation of female reproductive labor and female creative communal labor in general. Historic revolutions in the West have effectively done little more than add new economic groups to the collusion, like the 18th and 18th century edition of the European Vergese to the ruling elites of Europe, or the more complex 20th century edition of the Soviet political military elite to the Phacetic power organization of the West generally. The wealth of the West, the wealth making economic system known popularly as the Western free enterprise system, was built from the ground up, as we know, via brutalization of the working class, slave labor, and colonialism. 18th century laissez-faire liberal economics, now enjoying a revival as neoconservative economics, was solidly based and wholly dependent upon the violent exploitation of colonial resources and native or imported slave labor, as well as the forcible maintenance of indentured and subsistence wage labor in the home countries. Profits occurred in the free enterprise system solely because the profiteers were allowed, via the facetious collusion of state, business, military, religious elites, to ravage people and environments without paying recompense or undergoing regulation. It also had whole continents of untapped natural resources, Asia, India, Africa, the Americas, to lavishly plunder without interference. Indigenous populations of these rich continents were massacred, enslaved, missionized, destroyed by imported diseases, or pushed further and further into uninhabitable areas, which they managed to inhabit through sheer grit, while the colonialists ripped off all the good land. Many colonialized people fought back and sometimes won temporarily, but they could not hold out against well-armed imperial armies, especially in a mercilessly mercenary world in which no one cared if they were slaughtered or not, and few came to their aid. This is why the 18th century was the great heyday of laissez-faire profiteering. The world conditions were optimal for global plunder. Large-scale profit taking depends on these facetious conditions. In the 20th century, the conditions are reversed. Rapidly dwindling and polluting resources, and large decolonized populations, often armed and ready to throw off the yokes of Western exploitation. In this, they are backed by world sympathy and also usually by the military and economic support of one world power or another. Even if the third world was completely depopulated, 18th century style laissez faire profiteering could not be repeated for long. Due to their depletion by greed, many major world resources are due to run out, due to disappear by the end of the 20th century. The most dwindling resource of all, it seems, is the brain power of neoconservative economists and those free enterprise capitalist apologists who fail or refuse to see the complete reversal of global conditions and instead suggest that the solution to the 20th century is to return to the 18th and 19th centuries, that colonialist, imperialist paradise of unobstructive plunder, slave trading, and labor exploitation. In fact, the capitalist free market system is structurally and functionally incapable of working if it pays decent wages and provides full employment. This is why it must fight against worker empowerment through unionization. Evidence that free enterprise capitalism cannot work without one, facetious control, and two, subsistence level wages lies in the global factory system itself. American corporate capitalism saved itself by leaving America, where unionized workers had fought for and won relatively high wages and decent conditions and fringe benefits, and setting up free trade zones throughout the third world, where, as always, free is a euphemism for facetious control over workers' lives on and off the job, and the payment of feudal system wages. Neoconservative economics is, in effect, the same old fascist economics that have defined patriarchal exploit for profit social and moral systems from the beginning. The evolution of law and economics theory out of this mindset is inevitable. With human beings defined from womb to tomb as market commodities, and all laws governing social conditions and relations written to structure human life in terms of its market value. If we do not call this neo fascist economics, perhaps neo pastoralist would be appropriate, the breeding of human life for economic use and slaughter. What does this have to do with women, and in particular American women? The overwhelming majority of starving, malnourished, and homeless people on earth are women and children. In the third world, millions of women and children and elderly people, also displaced by chronic war and related famine, are crowded into refugee camps. Refugee camps have become, in fact, a permanent mode of existence for millions of people, most of them women and children. In the Western nations, more and more children and women of all ages are huddled at the bottom of the wobbling economic ladder, ghettoized, pauperized, permanently stigmatized as refugees from an economic system that cannot even support its own premises, let alone support all its poor people. American women and children are joining these populations of poverty refugees in larger and larger numbers every year. According to the 1980 census, more than 15% of Americans lived in poverty, 13 million of these children. This was before the Reagan administration's budget cuts. Since these cuts, at least 2 million more women have fallen below the government defined poverty level, and with them, more millions of children. As of January 1985, 1 out of 4 American children lives in what is considered to be official poverty. Nearly 35.7% of the households headed by women are impoverished. Among Black families headed by women, 56.1% are impoverished. As of February 1985, there were 3 million estimated homeless people in America, a number exceeding the number of homeless during the Great Depression of the 1930s. There are now 25,000 homeless people in the streets of Chicago alone, an estimated 7,000 of these being children, and a burgeoning number of the adult homeless being women. The Chicago Physicians Task Force on Hunger in January 1985 described childhood malnutrition in that city so severe that the children suffered from anemia, hair loss, and bloating, or official symptoms of starvation. They also documented an alarming increase in tuberculosis. Indeed, with the cutoff of medical funds and the closing of health clinics since 1980, tuberculosis has grown to near epidemic proportions among the poor in many major U.S. cities, especially infecting women and children. Tuberculosis is always a sign of malnutrition. The Chicago Physicians Task Force called TB an objective marker of hunger. In midwinter of January 1985, police were rounding up 600 homeless people a night from the streets of Boston. And in Washington, D.C., capital of world capitalism, there are now between 5,000 and 10,000 homeless people walking the streets. For a while, some of the homeless got warm at night by huddling over the sidewalk gratings where heat escapes from the government buildings. The Reagan administration responded to this free heat situation by spending thousands of tax dollars to build cement huts surrounded with sharp spikes around the gratings to ensure that no poor people would benefit from the escaping bureaucratic hot air. Demonstrations got the cement huts removed at more expense. Proponents of laissez-faire capitalism refer to the free enterprise system as the greatest enemy of poverty the earth has ever known. But as the free enterprise system is more and more unleashed in Americas in the 1980s, or as it is freed from the governmental restrictions and compensatory social welfare programs specifically designed in the decades since the 1930s to ameliorate the social and economic ravages of 2 centuries of unrestricted free enterprise activity. The number of poor is increasing right here in America. Faced with the statistical evidence of the increase of poverty and real hunger in America during the past 6 years, the administration's answer is to 1, insist that poverty is not a serious problem in America, 2, scrap all social welfare programs, and 3, turn the problem of a few unfortunates over to private charity. This, although all the private charity organizations in America have long ago publicly stated that the load is so enormous they are not capable of handling it, even with the welfare system still running. But the final solution to the poverty problem in America is officially to deny it exists or to blame it on lazy women and children. As Ruth Legger-Sivert pointed out, the poverty statistics affect more than the poor, and not only by wasting human resources. Large numbers of poor and unemployed people in a society pull the whole working class wage level downward and weaken the bargaining positions of working people vis-a-vis employers. Millions of working women in America are just one notch above the official poverty level. They must accept subsistence wages, unhealthy work conditions, and chronic on-the-job harassment for fear of losing employment altogether. Sweatshop conditions are returning to major American cities, Los Angeles, Boston, New York, where unlicensed substandard garment shops are springing up by the hundreds, where employers can get away with employing poor women up to 16 hours a day, 7 days a week without overtime, minimum wage rates, unemployment insurance, or even legal work safety conditions. All workers are threatened. The entire standard of work life plummets downward. The entire high-tech electronics industry in America, the vaunted leading edge of our economic recovery, is predicated on employing large numbers of immigrant women, 40%, in chemically hazardous jobs at average wages that are among the lowest in American industry. But these conditions are the only alternative for millions and millions of American women, short of total poverty, including homelessness. Since 1980, the American divorce rate has fallen noticeably. Fundamentalists think this means Americans have returned to God and family, but more likely it means that American women see less and less chance for economic survival for themselves and their children outside of marriage. Since 1980, reported incidents of wife beating and child abuse have noticeably increased. The economic pressures holding all these marriages together are also increasing the violence within the American family. Woman, worker, farmer, 1972. The average American woman works almost twice the hours and receives a little more than half the pay of the average American man. This fact has become a feminist cliche. If housewives were paid for their domestic work alone, they would earn $17,000 a year. This too has become a cliche. In lieu of payment, the average white middle class American homemaker is patted on the head and praised for her priceless work. A woman's work that is so important, it can't have a price tag put on it. This baloney comes from men who have deliberately constructed a world in which all power over life and death is a function of money or ascertainable wealth, period. A world of male power that is economically established on the fact of women's unpaid labor. But millions of married women accept this baloney and the patronizing head pats because they see very clearly that unpaid labor within a marriage is still better than most of the alternatives, or the effect of increasing poverty, especially of the feminization of poverty, is to force new generations of women into accepting the old traditional terms of patriarchal marriage. American mainstream feminism's offer of equality within the system becomes meaningless within a rotten system. A patriarchal fascist economic system ontologically predicated upon the exploitation of female labor cannot possibly offer huge numbers of women anything but two choices: economic enslavement inside of marriage or economic enslavement outside of marriage. A third choice is total poverty. It is women, in fact, it is the fact of women's labor that presents the most unanswerable challenge to the theoretical and practical claims of free enterprise economics. Very simply, it is the accumulated days, years, and centuries of women's unpaid or poorly paid labor that utterly refutes the astoundingly simple minded notion that hard work equals wealth. If hard work equaled wealth, all the world's women would be quite rich. But clearly, the world's women are not rich. In The Anatomy of Freedom, Robin Morgan quotes United Nations statistics presented by UN Secretary Kurt Waldheim in his official report to the UN Commission on the Status of Women in 1982. While women represent half of the global population and one-third of the labor force, they receive only 1/10 of the world income and own less than 1% of the world's property. They also are responsible for two-thirds of all the working hours on Earth. People who put in two-thirds of the world's working hours and receive in return 1/10 of the world's income should have something to say about the idea that hard work equals wealth. They should have something very interesting to say to the neoconservative enthusiasts who insist hard work is rewarded and only the lazy are poor. The bitter truth is, under 4,000 years of patriarchal exploit for profit economics, the women of the world have worked long and hard, often under the worst necrophilic conditions, to keep the human race minimally alive. In return, we receive mostly dismal statistics signifying not reward but ripoff. As Robin Morgan underscores in The Anatomy of Freedom, all those major issues labeled world problems are in fact women's problems. The world's starving millions are predominantly women and children. Some cultures traditionally give all their protein to men. In famine and other crises, food goes first to the male armies. It is women who are expected to stay alive on nothing, to feed infants and toddlers from their bodies as well, while gathering and preparing some kind of sustenance for everyone else, usually in terrain stripped of all nourishment. Over 90% of all the world's refugees are women and children. The world's poor are overwhelmingly women and children. And this means that most of the world's health problems, the problems of illiteracy and child abuse, are also women's problems, as is the problem of old age, of being old and caring for the old. The major problems facing the world today are women's problems. Yet, as Morgan notes, the male experts, the world analyzers and world developers, the world planners, continue to list these problems in a secondary category labeled women's issues, consigned to the dustbin. Even war, the glamorous male issue, is a woman's problem, for global female energy keeps going into the sustaining of biological life in the face of man's technological preoccupation with death. And it is man's preoccupation that gets all the funding. It is obsessive preparation for war that drains off all the resources of will and energy needed to continue life. It takes almost 10 months to make a human body. It takes a fraction of a millisecond to destroy one. Apparently, war oriented males feel this gives them a technological superiority over women, although all the superiority is on the side of death. Morgan also discusses how technological development, spearheaded by Western, predominantly American male experts, sets out that the very beginning to destroy third world women's traditional farming, craft, and marketing systems by turning over all the new machinery and development plans, the urban factory and rural agricultural technologies to the indigenous men. Only men are trained to use the new high powered machinery. Further, for the convenience of the machines, land is reallocated. The women's horticultural plots confiscated and turned over to men for large scale, often one crop farming, or the men are siphoned into urban factory centers, splitting not only families but whole cultures based on rural cooperative market systems run by women. The new industrial power is put in the hands of men, and the rural villages degenerate into company towns, virtually run by multinational corporations who even get tax credits for doing so. Morgan describes contemporary third world developmental programs as neo-colonial, merely a suave continuance of the old raw colonial style, with the developers manipulating indigenous males into bargains made between men and over the heads of women. One of the most consistent inconsistencies of man's neo-colonial approach is that where a local tradition is in the self-interest of women, such as matrifocal land ownership or batik industry controlled for generations by females, man overrides this tradition in the name of progress. But where a local tradition is deleterious deleterious to women, genital mutilation practices as rites of passage, or protein being considered a dietary taboo for women, man recognizes this tradition, expresses regard for it, and incorporates it into his plan for progress. Of course, this is not an inconsistency at all, but the classic imperialist ploy of dominating and manipulating a people by giving the men power over women, ideological power backed up with technological power, whether in the form of rifles or grain harvesters or textile factories. Men dominate women via superior technology, but this neo colonial maneuver not only usurps and destroys women's ancient skills and independence, it also turns a traditionally female based communal cooperative system into a male dominated wage and profit system. Thus, whole, once self sustaining, self articulating cultures are systematically redesigned into company towns, and the males collecting the profits are not indigenous men, we may be sure, but the managerial elite of multinational corporations. Seeing this process at work again and again can reinforce women's deeply ingrained hostility to technology, because in our bones, we know how all machinery has been used against us as weaponry. But as Morgan points out, and as we have tried to show in our discussion of women's Neolithic culture, women developed most of today's technologies. Ceramic, textile, and food processing were all women's inventions, and early industries, medicines and drugs, writing, printing, agriculture itself was produced by women. It is not technology per se that is the enemy of women, but a specifically male dominated use of it in a specifically male dominated system, or the patriarchal exploit for profit fastest economic system. Women's global task today is not to fight technology, to smash the machines and return to Stone Age handwork. Rather, we must study how the most modern and helpful technologies can be used within communal cooperative systems, not to the profit of the few, but to the benefit of the many. Technologies themselves are not politically or economically biased. They can be plugged into any system. They don't have to be profit making in order to work. It is people who must reorient and redesign our heads, our hearts, and our social matrices so that the technologies can be plugged into cooperative life sustaining systems rather than the competitive profit and power making systems of the past 4,000 years. And this reorientation and redesign means reactivating rather than destroying women's traditional communal cooperative patterns. And this means indigenous males everywhere refusing to be co opted by the global corporate development system into betraying the traditional women's cooperative cultures, both in their patriarchal organization and in their spiritual philosophical orientation, which was from the beginning the people first. Everywhere refers not only to men of the third world. The global corporation system is planning free trade zones for the Bronx and also for a 200-mile strip along the Mexican US border. And as Paul Virilio points out, Europe will be identified with the third world very shortly as a politically disempowered entity surviving as a colonial market and enterprise zone in the same relation to global corporate entities as Latin America is to the United States. Global means global after all, and global control refers not only to war power, but to complete economic, social, and ideological power over every aspect of every human life, with instantaneous electronic technological surveillance and enforcement. As Morgan writes, no one would deny that developing countries can use technological support, but such support must be keyed to the needs of all its citizens, not aimed at buying out half of them, a feat accomplished by selling out the other half. Men worldwide must learn that every time they sell out their women or their women's communal systems, they are only buying a prolongation of colonial enslavement for themselves, or neo-colonial enslavement, the same specter riding a motorcycle. In his last book, A Grunch of Giants, R. Buckminster Fuller pointed out that since the early 1970s, humankind has possessed the technology to feed, clothe, shelter, sustain, and entertain all of us at a very comfortable level. The problem, Fuller said, is not the absence of the necessary and appropriate technology, but obstructions to its fair distribution and optimal use. These obstructions are created by political, business, and religious institutions and ideologies, which depend for their existence on maintaining these obstructions, or national borders, exclusive markets, ideas of guilt and spiritual superiority as modes of both profit and identity. Technologies like earth, water, air, mineral resources belong to the human race. The obstructing institutions, by possessing their manufacture and distribution as private property or nationalistic or ethnic property, thus are able to control human beings as manufacturers of necessities control consumers of necessities. As Fuller and others have long observed, the capitalist system itself, the business financial investment system that feeds on human need and activity, is a parasitical rather than reproductive system. Business co-ops and takes co-ops, and takes credit for human invention, what the inventors of the world create, not in a vacuum, but out of the accumulated knowledge and experience of the world's human labor and discovery, and then turns around and sells these inventions at a net profit for itself, but at a gross loss to the species. Capitalism monopolizes world technology and resources, distributes them only for profit, and in fact, as a system based on calculations of greed rather than calculations of need, obstructs the existing and appropriate technologies from meeting the exigencies they would be able to meet within a radically different system of distribution and use. Fuller, certainly a master technologist, insisted that it was one, the capitalist market system, two, nationalist politics, and three, religious ideologies of guilt and punishment, ontologies of spirit versus flesh, these three obsolete factors which were alone keeping the adequate existing technologies from being mass produced, distributed worldwide, and plugged in immediately for the greater good of all. He acknowledged this might sound utopian, but against the only and inevitable alternative of mass extermination, he offered his suggestions and calculations as hardcore realism. It is not enough for Western feminists to fight for equality within a rotten system, for large masses of women to be exploited side by side with male workers on global assembly lines paying subsistence wages, for women to be drafted into armies side by side with men so both can fight in corrupt imperialist wars against indigenous revolutions all over the globe. This is no victory for women, nor is the entrance of a few token femmes into the managerial levels and executive boardrooms of giant corporations. Both integrations are co-optations of female energy into the maintenance of obsolete and criminal systems. Powerful systems, yes, but nonetheless obsolete and criminal. Where women are allowed to share equally in their profits and advantages, we also share equally in their crimes and in their obsolescence. Whatever. If the Soviet state capitalist system has become criminal and ontologically rigid under pressure from American based private capitalism, this has happened largely because its ruling male elite stopped short of, in fact, reversed a total sexual revolution, leaving patriarchal consciousness intact while it attempted a communalist restructuring that can only succeed in terms of matrifocal consciousness based on female sexual autonomy. Today, both major world powers are locked together in a male power dance. Both systems are trapped within the terms of their own patriarchal biases. One, control and profit via war, defense, security, and two, control and profit via labor exploitation, beginning with the exploitation of female reproductive labor and the dwindling resources of the earth. Continuous war and continuous energy exploitation have been the operating principles of patriarchal systems for 4,000 years. And no patriarchal system, American or Soviet, or any of their satellites, anyway, sorry. One, control and profit via war, defense, security, and two, control and profit via labor exploitation, beginning with the exploitation of female reproductive labor and the dwindling resources of the earth. Continuous war and continuous energy exploitation have been the operating principles of patriarchal systems for 4,000 years, and no patriarchal system, American or Soviet or any of their satellites, escapes the criminal stigma of these operating principles. Women must reject the constant co-optive suggestion that we have only these two choices: the man's capitalism or the man's communism. We must refute the constant diversionary suggestion that there is no precedent for a third choice: female oriented cooperative communalism, against 4,000 years of bronze to nuclear age patriarchy. We must set at least 300,000 years of female Stone Age precedents, during which time all the fundamental technologies and industries of human life were originated and elaborated to benefit all life, including the psychic, meditative, spiritual technologies, which have never been improved upon, but instead have been only lost, literalized, or fascistically degraded by the world's patriarchal religions. Remember that the great goddess was always a triplicity between all dualistic choices, all warring oppositions. Stood her being, a third term which mediated and synthesized the polarities into a new thing, an epiphany, the immanence of transcendence, the transcendence of immanence. The whole purpose of studying ancient women's religion and culture is to understand the great precedents for this term. This third alternative choice, neither the man's fascism nor the man's communism, but a radical return to the female beginning, a truly radical cooperative communalism that was at the root of human consciousness and culture. It is necessary for all of us to conceive that this female oriented creative collectivism existed, so that we can begin to perceive how it can be brought into being again on this contemporary turn of the spiral. To know it existed in the past is to give its future existence not only credibility but empowerment. We need this confidence of precedence not only as a core of spiritual vision, but as the core of our political vision. Only when we know truly and accurately what human beings have been and have done can we begin to envision both practical and numinous modes of future being and doing. William Irwin Thompson talks about the critically important relation between history, ontology, and politics. He argues that historic extrapolation from an ontology of man, the territorial possessor and aggressor, leads to one kind of politics, while the extrapolation from an ontology of woman, the creator and sharer of food, leads to quite another. Past, present, question mark, 1970. In terms of sociology of knowledge, one can say that one's vision of the origins of human culture affects one's political behavior in contemporary culture. If one believes that weapons and killing are the foundation of human culture, then one is inclined to accept a split in which technology superior cultures move forward while inferior cultures are helped on their way toward extinction. Through triage, a new global scientific elite determines who will survive, and through sociobiology, who should be chosen to survive. If, on the other hand, one believes with Glenn Isaacs that food sharing is the primordial act which made us human, then the global crises would generate a vision of compassion and sharing. Audrey's territorial imperative, man the killer vision, becomes the philosophical foundation and justification for a new authoritarian and technologically managed society. Isaac's vision becomes the basis for a totally different world culture of compassion, as the Buddhists say, for the suffering of all sentient beings. Of all which is to say that we are what we think, and that our vision of the origin of human culture is simply another description of our perception of the present condition. The compassionate food sharing definition of humanity, as we've shown, has precedence in the hundreds of thousands of years of matrifocal Stone Age culture. But of course, it is not a definition exemplified by women alone. Many men have embraced this definition, argued for it, propagated it, and given their lives for it. The greatest men have always embodied it, as that reasonable and mortal man Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1809, "The care of human life and happiness, and not their destruction, is the first and only legitimate object of good government." Or, in the words of the Argentinian poet and novelist Julio Cortázar, the moment comes when a truth becomes clear, a truth simple as it is wonderful, that of saving oneself alone is not saving oneself, or in any case, it doesn't justify us as human beings. And with that, I bid you good night. Next episode, The Magic Flight Home. Please stay tuned and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you again for visiting. Shalom.